Picture yourself settling back into the comfort of your bed, safe in the knowledge that tomorrow will likely unfold much as today did. The routine predictability of modern life, the simple certainty that the government won't suddenly demand your eldest son for military service. That bread will be available at the bakery, that speaking your mind won't land you in a police file. These are luxuries you might take for granted. Tonight, we journey back to a time when such certainties were rare commodities indeed. We're traveling to Paris during the height of Napoleon's empire, roughly between 1804. From the uniforms that fill the streets to the salons where power is both displayed and carefully negotiated. Let yourself sink deeper into your bed as we walk these paths, allowing the weight of history to settle gently around you like a familiar blanket, knowing that the struggles we witness belong to a world that exists now only in memory and imagination. Feel the weight of conscription notices posted on street corners, the careful dance of conversation in public spaces where the wrong word might reach the wrong ears, the constant underlying tension of a society perpetually mobilized for war. This is not the romanticized Paris of later imagination, but a city where survival required navigating an intricate maze of imperial bureaucracy, social expectations, and the ever-present possibility that the next knock on your door might change your life forever. And 1815, when the city pulsed with the rhythm of constant warfare, political surveillance, and imperial ambition. This was an era when glory and suffering walked hand in hand through the same cobblestone streets, when the promise of empire came with a price that ordinary citizens paid in ways both visible and hidden. Imagine yourself not as a tourist, observing from a safe distance, but as a resident of this turbulent city. The Paris of Napoleon's time was a city caught between worlds, still bearing the scars of revolutionary upheaval, while simultaneously reaching toward imperial grandeur. In these streets, you would have witnessed the curious contradiction of a society that proclaimed equality while creating new aristocracies, that celebrated merit while rewarding loyalty above all else. The very air seemed thick with possibility and peril in equal measure, where a clever merchant might rise to become a baron, or a careless word might see a respected citizen disappear into the machinery of state security. As we explore these streets together, notice how the grand spectacle of empire touches every aspect of daily existence, from the bread on your table to the secrets you keep. The day begins before dawn in the Paris of 1808, not with the gentle chime of alarm clocks, but with the measured cadence of drums echoing from the Champ de Mars. Imagine yourself awakening in a modest apartment above a bakery on the Rue Saint-Antoine, the scent of yesterday's bread still lingering in the air. And children, the floorboards creaking beneath your feet as you move toward the single window that faces the street. The imperial government has taken control of grain supplies, regulating prices and distribution with the mechanical precision that characterizes all aspects of life under Napoleon's rule. The others in line nod knowingly, their faces reflecting the resigned acceptance that has become the default expression of parents throughout the empire. Counts out your ration with the precision of someone who knows that a miscalculation could mean hunger for families down the line. Their movements are still awkward, their uniforms ill-fitting, but their instructors bark orders with the confidence of men who have learned their trade on actual battlefields. Some of these boys, for boys they are, despite their military bearing, will never see Paris again. Others will return bearing scars both visible and hidden, their youth exchanged for the glory of empire. The drums continue their steady rhythm, a metronome marking time toward an uncertain future. The bread is darker than it once was, the grain stretched with substitutes that reflect the empire as need to feed not just its civilians, but the vast armies that march across Europe under the tricolor banner. You accept your portion with the gratitude of someone who remembers when bread was scarce, when the revolution had disrupted the very foundations of daily sustenance. The conscription notices, posted with bureaucratic regularity on walls throughout the city, carry the weight of imperial decree. Young men between the ages of 20 and 25 find their names on these lists, their futures suddenly redirected toward the muddy fields of Spain or the frozen wastes of Russia. You queue at the bakery below, joining the line that forms each morning as the sun begins to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The conversations around you are muted, careful, peppered with the kind of elliptical references that have become the common language of a people who have learned to communicate in the spaces between words. The glass is thick and uneven, distorting the world beyond into a watercolor of muted shapes and shadows. Below, the street is already stirring with activity, though the sun has not yet crested the horizon. The baker's apprentice is hauling sacks of flour from a cart, his breath visible in the cool morning air, while across the way, a woman in a dark shawl hurries past, her footsteps echoing against the cobblestones with the urgency of someone who has learned that being late can carry consequences. Mingled with the dampness that seems to seep through the stone walls of these ancient buildings, the sound of those distant drums carries a weight that modern ears cannot fully comprehend. It is the sound of empire demanding its due, of young men being shaped into the instruments of Napoleon's ambition. You rise from your bed, perhaps sharing the small space with a spouse. The bread you depend upon for breakfast indeed, for every meal is no longer the simple commodity it once was. My nephew received his notice yesterday, whispers the woman ahead of you, her voice barely audible above the rustle of skirts and the shuffle of feet. The baker, a man whose flour-dusted apron and permanently weary expression speak to the countless dawns he has greeted in service to his neighborhood. Walking back to your apartment, you pass the local garrison, a converted monastery where young conscripts drill in the courtyard. Your own son, perhaps 15 years old, watches these drills with the mixture of fascination and dread that characterizes his generation. He has heard the stories of Austerlitz and Jena, of the emperor's genius and the Grande Armee's invincibility. You join the small crowds that gather around the official posting boards, reading the names with the careful attention of someone scanning for familiar faces. The bureaucracy of conscription is remarkably efficient, listing not just names, but occupations, addresses, and the specific regiments to which each man is assigned. Groups of soldiers move through the streets with the purposeful stride of men who have learned to march in formation, their equipment jangling with each step. Some are veterans, recognizable by their weathered faces and the easy confidence with which they carry their weapons. Others are recruits, still adjusting to the weight of their packs and the rhythm of military life. You learn to read these distinctions, to understand the subtle hierarchies that govern military society, because understanding such things might someday mean the difference between safety and danger for your own family. Some families have received their notices in advance, allowing for tearful farewells and the desperate hope that their sons might somehow avoid the worst of what awaits them. You attend Mass on Sundays, as expected of a good citizen, but the prayers for peace have been replaced by supplications for victory, for the safety of sons and husbands serving in distant campaigns. The priest, himself walking a careful line between spiritual guidance and political loyalty, speaks in measured tones about duty and sacrifice, about the divine providence that surely guides the emperor's campaigns. Even in these sacred spaces, the weight of empire presses down like incense-heavy air. Others learn of their fate only when they see their names posted publicly. The imperial administration displaying the same mechanical indifference to individual circumstances that characterizes all its operations. But he has also heard the whispered tales of the casualties that such victories demand. A wealthy family might hire a substitute to take their son's place, paying handsomely for the privilege of keeping their child safe from the emperor's wars. This commerce in human obligation creates its own economy, with brokers who specialize in matching families with willing substitutes. The moral complexity of such arrangements weighs heavily on those who can afford them, while those who cannot must watch their sons march away with the stoic acceptance of people who have learned that resistance is futile. In 5 years, his name might appear on those conscription lists, and this knowledge colors every interaction, every decision, every prayer whispered in the darkness of night. The empire's hunger for soldiers is insatiable, and no family can consider itself permanently exempt from its demands. The morning ritual of checking for new conscription notices has become as routine as buying bread. The system of replacement and substitution offers some hope for those with sufficient means. The sound of boots on cobblestones becomes the soundtrack of your daily existence. The churches, those ancient sanctuaries that once offered solace to previous generations, now ring with prayers that carry different meanings than they once did. The letters that arrive from the front carry news that families treasure and dread in equal measure. You gather with neighbors to share whatever information has reached your district, parsing each word for clues about the larger movements of war. Factories work around the clock, producing uniforms, weapons, and the countless supplies that feed the imperial war machine. Workers who once crafted luxury goods for the aristocracy now find themselves producing military equipment, their skills redirected toward the needs of conquest. The pay is steady, the work is reliable, but the knowledge that your labor directly contributes to the machinery of warfare adds a weight to each day as employment that previous generations of craftsmen never experienced. A son writes from Vienna, describing the grandeur of occupied palaces, but saying nothing about the battles that secured them. Another letter arrives from Spain, mentioning the heat and the difficulty of the terrain, but the careful omission of details suggests experiences too grim for civilian consumption. They play war games with the casual expertise of those who have watched actual soldiers drill, their toy battles reflecting the real conflicts that shape their world. They learn geography through the names of battlefields, understand politics through the lens of military strategy, and develop a precocious awareness of mortality that comes from living in a society where death is always a possibility rather than a distant abstraction. Their gains are punctuated by the arrival of official dispatches, by the sight of wounded soldiers returning from campaigns, by the quiet grief of families who receive news that their sons will not be coming home. These fragments of news become the pieces of a puzzle that no one can quite complete, a war that touches every family but remains frustratingly distant and incomprehensible. The economy of war creates its own rhythms and opportunities. Women, left behind as their men march away, adapt to roles that would have been unthinkable under the old regime. They manage businesses, negotiate contracts, and make decisions that affect not just their own families, but their communities. The social structures that once rigidly defined gender roles have been bent by necessity, creating new forms of independence even as they impose new burdens. A woman whose husband serves in the artillery corps might find herself managing his shop, dealing with suppliers, and making decisions about inventory and credit at what have once been his exclusive province. The children of this era grow up with a different understanding of normalcy than their parents possessed. As the morning progresses and the immediate rituals of bread and news give way to the day's work, the true complexity of surviving in Napoleon's Paris begins to reveal itself. The empire demands not just soldiers for its armies, but a complete reorganization of civilian life to support its military ambitions. If you are a craftsman, perhaps, a clockmaker, or a carpenter, your ability to practice. Your trade now depends on maintaining good standing with the authorities. The continental blockade against British goods has created shortages and substitutions that ripple through every level of the economy. A simple journey to visit relatives in a nearby town requires documentation, official approval, and the constant awareness that your movements are being monitored and recorded. You learn to read between the lines, to interpret the euphemisms and omissions that characterize official reporting. A tactical withdrawal might actually represent a significant defeat, while consolidating positions could mean that an entire army is in retreat. The skill of decoding official language becomes essential for understanding the true state of the empire's fortunes. But even this careful interpretation must be done privately, as questioning the official narrative can bring unwanted attention from the authorities. The freedom of movement that seems so natural to modern sensibilities becomes a privilege that must be negotiated with the state, subject to revocation without warning or explanation. This system of control extends beyond mere travel to encompass every aspect of social and economic life. A cabinet maker who once relied on exotic woods imported through British merchants must now source local materials or find alternative suppliers willing to risk the penalties associated with smuggling. The coffee that once graced middle-class breakfast tables has been replaced by chicory, the sugar by honey, or whatever sweeteners can be found. These substitutions, while individually minor, collectively represent the way that imperial policy shapes the most intimate details of daily life. The quality of your work matters less than your political reliability, your willingness to accept government contracts, and your discretion in matters that might touch upon state security. The medieval certainties of guild membership and hereditary occupation have been swept away, replaced by a system where survival depends on adaptability and careful political navigation. Every aspect of daily existence has been conscripted into service, from the food you eat to the work you perform, from the education your children receive to the very thoughts you are permitted to express publicly. The guilds that once regulated trade and craftsmanship have been replaced by imperial licenses and bureaucratic oversight. Consider the complexity of something as simple as obtaining the materials for your trade. The system of internal passports and travel permits creates another layer of bureaucratic complexity that governs every movement beyond your immediate neighborhood. The newspapers that circulate through the city carry news. That has been carefully filtered through the imperial censorship apparatus. Your children's education, once a matter of family tradition and local custom, now follows curricula designed to produce citizens loyal to the empire. The schools teach French rather than the regional dialects that might have been spoken in your grandparents' generation, emphasizing national unity over local identity. The direct taxes on property and income are supplemented by indirect taxes on goods, services, and even the documents required for legal transactions. A farmer who has spent years building up his livestock might find his best horses claimed for cavalry service, compensated with promissory notes that may or may not be honored by a government whose priorities lie elsewhere. The traditional saints' days compete with new holidays celebrating military victories, the emperor's birthday, and the anniversary of the founding of the empire. The most skilled physicians are recruited to serve with the army, leaving civilian communities to make do with less experienced practitioners. The hospitals prioritize the treatment of wounded soldiers over civilian patients, and the supplies of medicines and surgical instruments are allocated according to military rather than medical priorities. A civilian who suffers a serious injury or illness must navigate a healthcare system that views their needs as secondary to those of the empire's military machine. The churches themselves have been recruited into the service of the state, their pulpits used to announce government decrees, and their ceremonies adapted to include prayers for the success of French arms. The ancient rhythms of religious observance continue, but they are now overlaid with the newer rhythms of political loyalty and military necessity. The carts that once carried grain to market are pressed into service-moving military supplies, disrupting the normal patterns of trade and distribution that communities depend upon for their survival. The stamp duty on official papers, the customs duties on goods moving between regions, the license fees for various occupations, all of these contribute to the fiscal machinery that keeps the empire functioning. While this codification brings certain benefits in terms of legal clarity and consistency, it also represents a massive intrusion of state power into areas of life that were once governed by tradition and local custom. Marriage, inheritance, property rights, and business relationships are all now subject to the same legal framework throughout the empire. But this framework reflects the priorities and values of the imperial government rather than the preferences of local communities. The complexity of this system requires the services of tax farmers and collectors who become familiar figures in every neighborhood. their regular visits serving as reminders of the state's perpetual presence in civilian life. The lessons in history focus on the glorious achievements of French civilization, with particular attention to the military virtues that have made the empire possible. Mathematics lessons might involve calculating the supplies needed for a military campaign, while geography focuses on the territories that French arms have conquered and the strategic importance of various European capitals. The taxation system that funds this vast imperial enterprise touches every transaction, every inheritance, every business dealing. The conscription system extends beyond the simple drafting of soldiers to encompass the requisitioning of horses, carts, and supplies needed for military operations. The religious calendar, once the organizing principle of community life, has been subordinated to the demands of imperial celebration and commemoration. The medical system, such as it is, has been reorganized to serve the needs of the military first and civilian population second. The legal system that governs civilian life has been revolutionized by the Napoleonic Code, which brings uniformity to laws that were once a bewildering patchwork of local customs and royal decrees. The system of informants and surveillance that maintains order in the empire operates through networks of civilian cooperation that make every social interaction potentially dangerous. The concierge who controls access to your apartment building, the shopkeeper who knows your purchasing habits, the neighbors who observe your comings and goings, all of these people might be reporting to the authorities on your behavior, your associations, and your expressed opinions. This creates an atmosphere of constant vigilance and self-censorship that affects every conversation, every friendship, and every business relationship. The skilled metalworkers who once crafted ornate decorations for wealthy patrons now spend their days forging sword blades and cannon barrels. The textile workers who once produced silk and fine woolens for the fashion houses now manufacture the rough cloth that becomes military uniforms. The leather workers who once created delicate shoes and fine gloves now produce the sturdy boots and harnesses that equip cavalry regiments. This transformation of civilian industry into military production represents one of the most fundamental changes in how ordinary people experience their working lives under the empire. The postal system, which connects families separated by military service and maintains communication across the empire, is subject to systematic monitoring and censorship. Master craftsmen find themselves unable to maintain the traditional ratios of masters to apprentices when their most promising students are regularly called away for military service. This disruption creates labor shortages in essential trades, driving up wages for those who remain, but also creating anxiety about the long-term survival of traditional crafts and skills. The knowledge that has been passed down through generations of craftsmen is at risk of being lost as the empire's appetite for soldiers takes precedence over the maintenance of civilian expertise. Letters are opened, read, and sometimes confiscated if they contain information that the authorities consider sensitive or dangerous. The streets of Paris are filled with men who bear the scars of service, some missing limbs, others carrying less visible injuries that affect their ability to work and support their families. The government provides pensions and medical care for these veterans, but the bureaucracy involved in obtaining these benefits is complex and often inadequate to meet the actual needs of men who have sacrificed their health for the empire. The sight of these veterans serves as both a reminder of the glory of French arms and a sobering preview of what military service might mean for the young men currently being conscripted. This surveillance extends beyond mere military security to encompass political opinions, economic information, and personal relationships that might have political implications. The knowledge that every letter might be read by government agents affects not just what people write, but how they think about their own lives and relationships. The system of military hospitals and veterans' care creates a visible reminder of the human cost of imperial ambition. The workshops and factories that line the Seine have been transformed into extensions of the military supply chain. The apprenticeship system that once provided young men with a pathway into skilled trades has been disrupted by the constant Drain of military conscription. The market system that once operated according to seasonal rhythms and local customs now fluctuates according to the needs of military campaigns. When armies are preparing for spring offensives, the demand for horses, grain, and manufactured goods creates temporary prosperity for some suppliers. The traditional sources of credit, local merchants, guild associations, and regional banks have been supplemented by imperial institutions that prioritize loans for military contracts and government projects. A shopkeeper who needs credit to purchase inventory for the winter season might find that local lenders have already committed their resources to more politically favored enterprises. This reallocation of financial resources affects everything from the variety of goods available in markets to the ability of small businesses to survive economic downturns. When campaigns end unsuccessfully, the return of unpaid soldiers and the disruption of trade routes can cause local economic collapse. The predictable cycles of agriculture and commerce that previous generations relied upon have been replaced by the unpredictable demands of warfare, making long-term planning nearly impossible for ordinary citizens. The banking and credit systems that facilitate commerce have been reorganized to serve the empire's financial needs first and civilian needs second. The transportation system that connects Paris to the rest of France and Europe has been militarized to serve the needs of troop movement and supply logistics. The roads that once carried civilian traffic according to market needs now prioritize military convoys and official communications. A merchant who once could expect to travel freely between cities now must plan around military traffic, accept delays caused by troop movements, and navigate checkpoint systems that can add days to even simple journeys. The postal routes that carry personal correspondence are secondary to the military communications that keep the imperial command structure functioning. As afternoon settles over the city and the initial urgency of morning tasks gives way to the steadier rhythms of daily work, the psychological weight of living in perpetual preparation for war begins to manifest in subtle but pervasive ways. Their wooden swords are carved to resemble the real weapons carried by the soldiers they see daily. The traditional prayers for peace have been replaced by supplications for victory. The familiar litanies modified to include requests for the safety of specific regiments and the success of particular campaigns. The feast days that once celebrated local saints and seasonal changes now compete with imperial holidays that commemorate military victories and political events. A merchant who enters into a long-term contract with a supplier must consider the possibility that key personnel might be conscripted, that transportation routes might be disrupted by military operations, or that government requisitions might claim goods that were intended for civilian markets. The letters of credit and promissory notes that facilitate commerce must include provisions for the delays and disruptions that are inevitable in a society organized around military priorities. The Church itself has become an instrument of state policy, its ancient authority subordinated to the needs of imperial administration. The classical curriculum that once emphasized literature, philosophy, and rhetoric has been supplemented with subjects that have immediate military applications, mathematics that can be used for artillery calculations, geography that focuses on strategic considerations, and history that emphasizes the military virtues that have made France great. The teachers who deliver this education are themselves subject to supervision and evaluation based on their effectiveness in producing patriotic citizens rather than independent thinkers. Their marching songs echo the regimental music that drifts from the garrison quarters. Young couples must plan their weddings around conscription schedules, knowing that a husband might be called away immediately after the ceremony. The traditional patterns of courtship and engagement are compressed into the brief periods when young men are available, creating an atmosphere of urgency around romantic relationships that would have been foreign to earlier generations. The dowry negotiations that once focused on property and social standing now must account for the possibility that the groom might not survive his military service, leading to complex arrangements for the support of potential widows. Their heroes are not saints or legendary figures, but living generals, whose exploits are recounted in the censored newspapers and official proclamations. This militarization of childhood imagination represents one of the most profound ways that the empire reshapes civilian consciousness, creating a generation that thinks of warfare as the natural state of human affairs. The constant awareness that the empire is always at war, somewhere that your neighbor's sons are fighting battles in distant lands, that the next conscription notice might call your own family to service. This knowledge creates a background tension that colors every aspect of social and emotional life. The children who play in the courtyards and narrow streets of Paris engage in games that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. The religious observances that once provided comfort and stability in times of uncertainty have been adapted to accommodate the realities of perpetual warfare. The marriage customs that govern family formation have been altered by the constant possibility of military service. The business partnerships and commercial relationships that form the foundation of economic life must account for the unpredictability created by military obligations. The educational system that shapes young minds has been redesigned to produce citizens who think of military service as the highest form of civic duty. The entertainment and cultural activities that once provided relief from daily concerns have been reorganized to serve the propaganda needs of the empire. The theaters that once presented classical dramas and comedies now feature plays that celebrate military virtues and imperial achievements. The festivals that once celebrated local traditions and seasonal changes now incorporate parades of military units and displays of captured enemy equipment. The courts that once operated according to local customs and traditional procedures now function as extensions of imperial administration, with judges who are appointed based on their loyalty to the government rather than their knowledge of law. The legal codes that once varied from region to region have been standardized according to imperial priorities, creating a uniform system that serves the needs of centralized administration, but may not reflect the preferences of local communities. The regional dialects that once marked local identity are being replaced by standardized French as the language of administration and education. The local festivals that once celebrated particular saints or seasonal events are being supplemented by imperial holidays that emphasize political rather than religious or agricultural themes. The folk traditions that once provided communities with distinctive identities are being homogenized into a broader imperial culture that serves the needs of political unity, but may sacrifice the diversity that once enriched local life. The songs that once told stories of local heroes and romantic adventures now focus on the exploits of French soldiers and the glory of serving the emperor. The constant vigilance required to navigate the surveillance systems, the careful attention needed to avoid political mistakes, the emotional energy required to manage the anxiety of having family members in military service. All of these demands create a fatigue that goes beyond mere physical tiredness. It is the exhaustion that comes from living in a society where the personal is always political, where private concerns must always be subordinated to public duties, and where the simple act of survival requires constant attention to forces beyond individual control. The postal system that carries personal correspondence is secondary to the official communications that maintain imperial control. The newspapers that inform citizens about current events are subject to censorship and manipulation that ensures their content supports government policy. The rumor networks that once provided unofficial channels for information sharing are now monitored and infiltrated by government agents seeking to identify and suppress dissent. The craft traditions that once passed specialized knowledge from generation to generation have been disrupted by the constant train of young men into military service. The guilds that once regulated the quality of work and maintained professional standards have been replaced by imperial licensing systems that prioritize political reliability over technical competence. The apprenticeship programs that once provided pathways for social advancement now compete with military recruitment for the attention of young men, creating a brain drain that affects every aspect of civilian society. The legal system that governs disputes and maintains order has been militarized to support the needs of the empire. The communication networks that connect different parts of the empire have been organized to serve military and political needs first and civilian needs second. The cultural identity that once united communities around shared traditions and local customs has been redirected toward imperial loyalty and French nationalism. As evening approaches and the day's work begins to wind down, the psychological toll of living under these conditions becomes most apparent. The evening meal, when families gather to share the day's experiences and plan for tomorrow's challenges, has become a time of careful conversation and guarded optimism. The topics that can be discussed openly have been narrowed by the awareness that even domestic conversations might be overheard and reported. The plans that can be made confidently have been limited by the unpredictability of government demands and military obligations. The hopes that can be expressed honestly have been tempered by the knowledge that individual desires must always be secondary to imperial needs. The bedtime rituals that once provided comfort and security for children now include prayers for the safety of soldiers and the successive campaigns that will determine the fate of the empire. The stories that parents tell their children now feature military heroes and patriotic themes rather than the fairy tales and folk stories that once sparked imagination and wonder. The lullabies that once soothed children to sleep now carry messages about duty and sacrifice that prepare young minds for the responsibilities they will inherit as citizens of a militarized society. Imagine yourself in the early morning hours of March 5, 1815, awakening not to the familiar rhythms of imperial Paris, but to something far more unsettling, an absence of certainty that has settled over the city like fog rolling in from the Seine. The Bourbon Restoration, that careful arrangement of old nobility and new bureaucracy that has governed France for nearly a year, has created its own patterns of daily life, its own expectations and limitations. The local authorities have been informed, but their response has been delayed, confused, inadequate to the magnitude of what may be unfolding. The baker's voice dropping to a confidential murmur as he leans across the counter. His information comes from a cousin who works in the postal service, but many of them served under Napoleon during the great campaigns that made France the master of Europe. Their allegiance to the new regime is professional rather than personal, based on duty and discipline rather than the passionate devotion that once characterized their service to the emperor. The officers who command them include men who received their commissions from Napoleon's hand, who learned their trade in the battles that established French dominance over the continent. The transition to serving the Bourbon Restoration has been managed with the mechanical efficiency that characterizes military bureaucracy, but it has not necessarily changed the deeper loyalties that exist in the hearts of men who once marched to Vienna and Berlin under the imperial eagles. Who has noticed that certain official dispatches are being routed through irregular channels, that messages marked with unusual urgency are moving between government buildings at odd hours. The details are vague, but the implications are staggering. Could it really be possible that Napoleon Bonaparte, the man whose exile to Elba was supposed to have ended forever his influence on European affairs, has somehow returned to French soil? The initial reports speak of a minor incident, a small band of troublemakers who will surely be apprehended before they can cause any real disruption, more delicate than any diplomatic negotiation. For nearly a year, the people of France have been adjusting to life under the restored Bourbon monarchy, learning to navigate new social expectations, new political realities, new economic arrangements. The white cockade has replaced the tricolor. The lily of France have supplanted the imperial eagle, and the songs that echo through the streets now celebrate the return of legitimate authority rather than the glory of conquest. But beneath this surface adjustment, deeper currents of loyalty and memory have continued to flow, largely invisible but never entirely dormant. But there is something in the tone of these reports, something in the careful language used by officials, who are trying to maintain calm while grappling with possibilities they dare not name directly that suggest the situation may be far more serious than anyone is willing to admit publicly. You have learned to navigate this new world with the same careful attention to political currents that survival in Napoleon's empire once required. But the skills are subtly different. The dangers less dramatic, but no less real. The news, when it first reaches the capital, arrives not through official channels, but through the whispered conversations of merchants who have traveled from the south. Through the careful observations of postal workers who have noticed irregularities in the flow of correspondence. Through the nervous energy of government officials who find themselves called to unexpected meetings in the early hours of morning. The information comes in fragments, each piece seemingly innocuous on its own, but together forming a picture that challenges everything that has been assumed about the political stability of the restored monarchy. A ship has landed near Cannes. A small group of men has come ashore, led by a figure whose identity seems almost too extraordinary to believe. You hear these first whispers while purchasing your morning bread. The psychology of this moment is perhaps more complex than any military campaign. The soldiers who patrol the streets of Paris wear the uniform of the Royal Army. As the morning progresses and more information begins to filter into the capital, the careful equilibrium that has governed political life under the Restoration begins to show signs of strain. The government officials who have spent months establishing their authority under the new regime find themselves confronting a crisis that their carefully constructed administrative systems are not equipped to handle. The suppliers who have cultivated relationships with Bourbon officials, the craftsmen who have learned to produce goods that appeal to royalist sensibilities, the writers who have produced works celebrating the return of legitimate monarchy, the artists who have created images glorifying the Bourbon dynasty, the representatives of the Allied powers who defeated Napoleon in 1814, had assumed that his exile to Elba represented a permanent solution to the problem he posed to European stability. For ordinary citizens who had begun to adapt to life under the Restoration, the news forces a reconsideration of assumptions about the permanence of political arrangements, the reliability of official information, and the predictability of their own futures. The workers who had accepted employment in enterprises that served the new government, all of these people find themselves questioning decisions that had seemed prudent and necessary just days before. The psychological energy that had been invested in learning new ways of thinking and behaving under the Restoration suddenly seems wasted, or worse, potentially compromising if political circumstances change dramatically. The careful mental adjustments that had allowed people to function effectively under the new regime suddenly seem premature, possibly dangerous, certainly inadequate to deal with the possibilities that are now emerging. The discovery that he may have escaped from his island prison and returned to France creates a diplomatic crisis that could potentially unravel the entire system of agreements that ended the previous war. The musicians who have composed pieces honoring the Restoration, all of these cultural figures find themselves wondering whether their recent work may become a liability if political circumstances change dramatically. The service providers who have built their clientele among the returning émigrés, all of these people suddenly face the possibility that their careful political calculations may have been based on assumptions that are no longer valid. The police networks that have been organized to maintain order under the Bourbon monarchy were designed to deal with conventional threats, political dissent, economic unrest, criminal activity, not with the possibility that the most famous man in Europe might suddenly reappear to challenge the entire foundation of the current political arrangement. The merchants and shopkeepers who have adapted their businesses to serve the tastes and preferences of the restored nobility find themselves uncertain about how to respond to news that could potentially overturn all of their recent investments in political reliability. The intellectual and cultural circles that have accommodated themselves to the literary and artistic preferences of the Restoration begin to sense that the political winds may be shifting in directions that could affect their careers and social standing. The foreign diplomatic community that has established itself in Paris to manage the complex international arrangements that followed. Napoleon's first abdication suddenly faces the possibility that all of their careful negotiations may need to be reconsidered. The psychological impact of these developments extends far beyond the immediate political implications. The women who had learned to navigate the social expectations of the restored court, the merchants who had adapted their business practices to serve royalist customers, the children who had been taught to sing new songs celebrating the Bourbon monarchy, who had learned new lessons about French history that emphasized the legitimacy of royal authority, who had been encouraged to think of Napoleon as a dangerous usurper whose defeat represented the triumph of righteous government. These young people suddenly find themselves in a world where the basic categories of right and wrong, loyalty and betrayal, success and failure may need to be completely reconsidered. And finally, to the kind of carefully worded official statements that reveal as much through their omissions as through their explicit content. The government acknowledges that there has been some kind of incident in the South, that measures are being taken to address the situation, that citizens can be confident that appropriate action will be taken to maintain order and stability. But the very need to issue such reassurances suggests that the situation is serious enough to require official attention, and the careful language used in these statements indicates that the authorities are not entirely confident about their ability to control whatever is happening. As the day progresses and more detailed information begins to reach Paris, the initial whispers give way to more substantial rumors and to unofficial reports. The military units stationed in and around Paris begin to show signs of increased activity. Officers receive new orders, equipment is inspected and prepared, communications are established with outlying garrisons. The preparations are conducted with professional efficiency, but there is an undercurrent of tension that suggests the military leadership is not entirely certain about how their forces will respond if they are called upon to take action against Napoleon and his supporters. The loyalty of troops who once served under the emperor remains an unknown factor in calculations that could determine the fate of the Restoration and the future of France. By midday on March 5th, as the sun climbs higher over the rooftops of Paris and the initial shock of the morning, revelations begins to settle into a deeper awareness of their potential implications. The conversations that take place in coffeehouses and markets, in workshops and government offices, carry an undercurrent of excitement and apprehension that had been absent during the months of Bourbon rule. People who had learned to speak carefully about political matters under the Restoration find themselves engaged in discussions that would have been dangerous just days before, but now seem not only permissible, but necessary. The psychological dynamics of what is unfolding begin to reveal themselves with increasing clarity. The taverns where workers gather after long days, the markets where housewives share news while purchasing their daily necessities, the police networks that had been organized to monitor dissent under the Restoration are not equipped to deal with the subtle shift in public mood that begins to manifest itself as word of Napoleon's return spreads through the city. The informants who had been recruited to report on anti-royalist sentiment find themselves trying to interpret conversations that operate in a kind of code, where meanings are conveyed through tone and implication rather than explicit statement. The news of Napoleon's landing has moved beyond the realm of rumor and speculation to become a confirmed fact that demands response from every level of French society. These young men and women had lived through the transition from imperial glory to Bourbon legitimacy, learning to suppress their memories of the excitement and possibility that had characterized the Napoleonic era. They had trained themselves to find satisfaction in the more modest ambitions and conventional pleasures that the Restoration offered, but the news of Napoleon's return suddenly makes it permissible to remember what it had felt like to be part of an empire that dominated Europe. But the nature of that response remains uncertain, complicated by the complex web of loyalties, fears, and aspirations that have been created by 25 years of revolutionary and imperial upheaval. The streets of Paris, which had begun to take on the more sedate character appropriate to a restored monarchy, suddenly seemed charged with a different kind of energy. The veterans of Napoleon's campaigns, who had maintained a discreet silence about their experiences during the Restoration, begin to emerge from the shadows of political caution. These men, many of them still bearing the physical scars of service in the Grande Armée, had learned to present themselves as loyal subjects of the restored monarchy, accepting their pensions and honors from the Bourbon government, while carefully avoiding any expression of lingering attachment to their former emperor. But the news of Napoleon's return creates a space for them to acknowledge, at least among themselves, the emotions and loyalties that they had been forced to suppress. The process by which this change occurs is gradual and subtle, beginning with carefully coded references and meaningful glances, progressing to more direct expressions of opinion, and eventually developing into open discussions of possibilities that had been unthinkable under the Restoration. A former sergeant who had served at Austerlitz might casually mention to a neighbor that he had heard interesting news from the south. A veteran of the Spanish campaign might observe to a fellow former soldier that political situations can change more rapidly than anyone expects. A retired officer might note to his friends that military loyalty is a complex matter that depends on many factors beyond simple obedience to current authority. These conversations take place in the spaces that exist between official surveillance and private thought, the workshops where men labor side by side. The younger generation, those who had come of age during the Empire but had been forced to adapt to the very different expectations of the Restoration, begin to experience a kind of psychological liberation that is difficult to describe but unmistakable in its effects. The economic implications of Napoleon's return begin to manifest themselves almost immediately, as merchants and business owners try to calculate how political change might affect their enterprises. The suppliers who had cultivated relationships with royalist officials begin to hedge their bets, quietly reaching out to contacts who might be useful if the imperial system is restored. The craftsmen who had adapted their skills to serve the tastes of the returned nobility begin to consider how quickly they could adjust their production to meet the different demands of an imperial court. The carefully constructed relationships that had been built between French officials and foreign diplomats under the Restoration suddenly seemed fragile and provisional. The editors and journalists who had spent months learning to write within the constraints imposed by Bourbon censors suddenly faced the prospect that those constraints may be irrelevant if the political system changes fundamentally, and imperial suppression begins to confront the possibility that its recently recovered influence may once again be threatened. The clergy who had celebrated the Restoration as a return to the proper relationship between church, writers who had produced literature celebrating the return of traditional values, the artists who had created works glorifying the Bourbon monarchy, the musicians who had composed pieces honoring the Restoration, all of these cultural figures find themselves wondering whether their recent work may become a liability if Napoleon successfully reestablishes his authority, and state find themselves uncertain about how to respond to developments that could potentially return France to the more secular governance that characterized the Napoleonic period. The prayers that are offered in churches throughout Paris during this period reflect the uncertainty of religious leaders who are trying to navigate between their loyalty to legitimate authority and their concern for the welfare of their congregations. The newspapers that appear on March 6th and the days following carry stories that reveal the difficulty of reporting on a situation that is evolving too rapidly for conventional journalistic treatment. The teachers who had adapted their lessons to celebrate the Bourbon dynasty and criticize the imperial period find themselves uncertain about how to present recent events to their students. The textbooks that had been rewritten to present Napoleon as a dangerous tyrant whose defeat represented the triumph of legitimate government suddenly seem potentially problematic if political circumstances change. The social events that had brought together French and foreign elites under the auspices of the Bourbon court are quietly canceled or postponed as everyone waits to see how the political situation will develop. The financial institutions that had aligned themselves with the Bourbon government begin to make discreet inquiries about how they might position themselves advantageously if political circumstances changed dramatically. The international dimensions of Napoleon's return create additional layers of complexity that affect every level of French society. The treaties that ended the previous war had established France's place in a European system dominated by the Allied powers, who defeated Napoleon in 1814. News of his return immediately raises questions about how those powers will respond, whether they will honor their commitments to intervene militarily if Napoleon attempts to regain power, and what the consequences might be for ordinary French citizens if France once again finds itself at war with most of Europe. The diplomatic community in Paris begins to show signs of intense activity as representatives of foreign governments try to assess the situation and communicate with their home capitals about how to respond. The press, which had learned to function under the censorship system of the Restoration, finds itself in an impossible position as it tries to report on developments whose implications are too significant to ignore, but too dangerous to address directly. The religious establishment, which had been restored to a position of prominence under the Bourbon monarchy after years of revolutionary. The educational system that had been reorganized under the Restoration to emphasize traditional values and royalist loyalty suddenly faces the prospect that its curriculum and teaching methods may need to be reconsidered. The cultural and artistic communities that had accommodated themselves to the aesthetic preferences of the Restoration begin to sense that the intellectual climate may be shifting in directions that could affect their work and their careers. As evening approaches on March 5th, and the first full day of awareness about Napoleon's return draws to a close, conversations that take place in homes throughout Paris on the evening of March 5th reveal the extent to which Napoleon's return has already begun to change how people think about their own lives and futures. Families who had made peace with the limitations and opportunities of the Restoration find themselves discussing possibilities that would have seemed absurd just days before. Children who had been taught to think of Napoleon as a figure from the past suddenly hear their parents speaking of him as someone who might once again shape their futures. Veterans who had resigned themselves to living quietly under the new regime find themselves wondering whether their military experience might once again become relevant to their country's needs. The psychological transformation that has begun in Paris starts to reveal its true dimensions. Psychological impact of these developments extends far beyond immediate political considerations to touch the deepest levels of personal identity and social belonging. For people who had lived through the revolutionary and imperial periods, Napoleon's return represents not just a potential change in government, but a possible restoration of a way of thinking about France and its place in the world that had seemed permanently lost. For those who had accommodated themselves to the Restoration, it represents a challenge to assumptions about political stability and personal security that had seemed safely established. The careful political equilibrium that had governed life under the Restoration has been disrupted, not by military action or administrative decree, but by the simple fact that possibilities which had seemed permanently foreclosed have suddenly become viable again. The mental landscape that had been shaped by nearly a year of Bourbon rule has been jolted by the reminder that political arrangements which seem solid and permanent can change with startling rapidity. March 7th, 1815. 2 days have passed since the first whispers reached Paris, and the news of Napoleon's progress northward has transformed from rumor to confirmed reports that arrive with increasing frequency and disturbing regularity. Napoleon has not merely landed in France. He has begun a march northward that is gathering momentum with every mile, every hour, every encounter with the forces sent to arrest him. For the citizens of Paris who have spent months adjusting to life under the Restoration, the news challenges every assumption about political loyalty, military discipline, and the permanence of governmental authority. The Bourbon monarchy, which had seemed securely established just days before, suddenly appears fragile and provisional. The news of each defection encourages the next. The story of each unit's decision to join Napoleon makes it easier for the following unit to make the same choice. What begins as isolated incidents of military indiscipline gradually becomes a pattern of behavior that calls into question the entire foundation of Bourbon authority over the French military establishment. The military forces upon which that monarchy depends for its survival have revealed themselves to be unreliable, their loyalty conditional rather than absolute. The psychological pressure they had endured while serving under the Bourbon monarchy, the necessity of suppressing their true feelings, the difficulty of reconciling their past service with their present obligations, the sense that their greatest achievements had been relegated to an embarrassing historical footnote, suddenly lifts as it becomes permissible, even patriotic, to acknowledge their continued devotion to the man who had led them to glory. The military units dispatched to capture the escaped emperor have not engaged him in battle, they have joined him. When Napoleon encounters the first troops sent to apprehend him, he does not fight them or flee from them. He walks directly toward them, alone and unarmed, and appeals to their memories of shared service and common cause. The effect is immediate and decisive. Soldiers who had been prepared to arrest him instead cheer him. Officers who had orders to return him to custody instead offer him their swords. And entire regiments that had been dispatched to end his return instead become part of the force that makes his success possible. The officers who were ordered to return him to custody have instead rallied to his cause. The soldiers who were supposed to enforce his rearrest have instead swelled the ranks of his growing army. You wake to a city that feels fundamentally different from the one you inhabited just a week ago, though the physical streets and buildings remain unchanged. The transformation is psychological, atmospheric, almost mystical in its pervasiveness, as if the very air of Paris has become charged with possibilities that had seemed permanently extinguished. The reports that filter into the capital throughout the morning hours tell a story that seems almost too extraordinary to believe, yet too well documented to dismiss. The psychological impact of these reports cannot be overstated. The process by which this transformation is occurring follows a pattern that seems to operate according to its own internal logic rather than the conventional rules of military and political behavior. This phenomenon repeats itself with each successive encounter, creating a kind of avalanche effect that seems to gain power and momentum from its own success. The veterans of Napoleon's campaigns, who had maintained their silence under the Restoration, find themselves vindicated in their persistent loyalty to their former emperor. The younger soldiers, those who had entered military service under the Restoration and had never served under Napoleon directly, find themselves caught between competing loyalties and conflicting narratives about their duty. They have been trained to serve the Bourbon monarchy and to think of Napoleon as a dangerous enemy of legitimate government. But they are also heir to a military culture that was shaped by the Napoleonic legend. The stories they have heard from older soldiers, the traditions they have inherited from the Grande Armée, the Allied powers who had defeated Napoleon in 1814 and negotiated the treaties that established the European settlement after his first abdication, find themselves confronting the possibility that all their careful diplomatic work may need to be undone. The representatives of foreign governments in Paris begin to receive urgent instructions from their home capitals about how to respond to developments that threaten to destabilize the entire continental system. The professional identity they have absorbed from institutions that were created during the Empire, all of these influences suddenly seem more relevant than the formal allegiance they owe to the current government. The Austrians, whose emperor's daughter had married Napoleon during the height of his power, faced the complex task of responding to the return of their former son-in-law. The Prussians, who had suffered devastating defeats at Napoleon's hands before ultimately contributing to his downfall, prepare for the possibility of renewed conflict with their most dangerous enemy. The Russians, who had endured the catastrophic invasion of 1812, but had also played a crucial role in Napoleon's defeat, begin to mobilize resources for what could become another prolonged European war. The civilian population of Paris watches these developments with a mixture of excitement and apprehension that reflects the complexity of their own relationships to both the Restoration and the imperial legacy. For some, Napoleon's return represents the possibility of recovering a sense of national greatness that had been lost during the months of Bourbon rule. For others, it represents the frightening prospect of renewed warfare and international conflict that could disrupt the stability they had begun to value under the Restoration. For most, it represents something more complex, a reminder that the political arrangements they had learned to take for granted were more fragile than they had assumed. The economic implications of Napoleon's progress toward Paris begin to manifest themselves in subtle but significant ways. The merchants who had invested in relationships with Bourbon officials begin to recalculate their political strategies, quietly making approaches to contacts who might be useful if the imperial system is restored. The suppliers who had adapted their businesses to serve the preferences of the restored nobility begin to consider how they might adjust their operations to meet the different demands of an imperial court. The craftsmen who had learned to produce goods that appealed to royalist sensibilities begin to remember the skills they had developed during the original empire. The international dimensions of Napoleon's return create ripple effects that extend far beyond France's borders. The British, who had played a leading role in the coalition that defeated Napoleon, immediately begin to consider the military and diplomatic measures that would be necessary to contain his return. The psychological impact of these international developments on the French population is profound and immediate. The news that foreign powers are already discussing military intervention to prevent Napoleon's return reminds French citizens of the extent to which their country's internal affairs are subject to external influence. The clergy had welcomed the Restoration as an opportunity to recover the influence and authority they had lost during the revolutionary and imperial periods, but they now face the prospect that their recently regained prominence may once again be threatened. The careful political equilibrium that had governed life under the Restoration has been completely disrupted, replaced by a state of uncertainty and anticipation that affects every aspect of daily life. The mental categories that had been used to understand political reality, legitimacy and usurpation, loyalty and treason, order and chaos, suddenly seem inadequate to describe a situation that transcends conventional political analysis. The bishops who had celebrated the return of the Bourbon monarchy as a restoration of proper Christian government find themselves uncertain about how to respond to developments that could return France to the more secular governance that characterized the Napoleonic period. Families that had made their peace with the Restoration find themselves discussing possibilities that would have seemed fantastic just days before. Veterans who had resigned themselves to quiet retirement under the Bourbon monarchy find themselves wondering whether they might once again be called to serve their former emperor. Young people who had never experienced the excitement of the imperial period find themselves imagining what it might be like to live through historical events of genuine significance. The Restoration had been established with foreign support and maintained through foreign guarantees, but this dependence on external powers had been largely invisible during the months of relative stability and possibilities that reflect the extraordinary nature of the times they are living through. Some dream of military glory and national greatness restored, others of foreign invasion and renewed warfare, still others of personal opportunities and dangers that can emerge from the political upheaval that seems increasingly inevitable. But few sleep peacefully, for they are living through one of those rare moments in history when the future seems genuinely open, when established certainties dissolve and new possibilities emerge with startling rapidity. Napoleon's return suddenly makes this dependence explicit and problematic, forcing French citizens to confront questions about national sovereignty and independence that had been largely dormant under Bourbon rule. That his progress toward Paris continues with the same mysterious momentum that has characterized his march from the very beginning. But even without that specific information, the citizens of Paris who retire on the evening of March 7th sense that they are living through the final hours of the Restoration, that the political world they have known for nearly a year is about to be swept away by forces that operate according to their own logic, rather than the conventional rules of government and administration. The religious establishment finds itself in an increasingly difficult position as Napoleon's return progresses. The cultural and intellectual communities that had accommodated themselves to the aesthetic and ideological preferences of the Restoration begin to sense that fundamental changes in the intellectual climate may be imminent. The writers who had produced works celebrating traditional values and royalist legitimacy, the artists who had created pieces glorifying the Bourbon dynasty, the scholars who had reinterpreted French history to emphasize the continuity between the old regime and the Restoration, all of these cultural figures find themselves wondering whether their recent work may become not just irrelevant, but potentially compromising if Napoleon successfully reestablishes his authority. As March 7th draws to a close and reports continue to arrive describing Napoleon's inexorable progress toward the capital, the psychological transformation of Paris reaches a critical phase. The conversations that take place throughout Paris on the evening of March 7th reveal how completely the news of Napoleon's return has altered the psychological landscape of the city. The sleep that comes to the citizens of Paris on the night of March 7th, 1815, is troubled by dreams. The dawn that will break on March 8th will bring news that Napoleon has reached Lyons, that the garrison there has joined him without resistance. Picture yourself, if you will, in the labyrinthine corridors of the Prefecture of Police on the Isle de la Cite, where the morning light filters through tall windows onto walls lined with filing cabinets that contain the secrets of an entire population, and the discretion of confessors carrying leather portfolios filled with reports that detail the previous day's harvest of human intelligence. Each citizen who has attracted official attention possesses a file that grows steadily thicker with time, fed by reports from a network of informants that extends into every level of society. A citizen who expresses doubts about government policy becomes someone who manifests uncertainty regarding official measures. A gathering that discusses political topics transforms into an assembly characterized by irregular discourse. A person who maintains contacts with individuals of questionable loyalty is described as someone who sustains associations of ambiguous character. This bureaucratic euphemism serves multiple purposes. It protects officials who must handle sensitive information. It creates plausible deniability for actions taken based on surveillance reports. And it maintains the fiction that the empire operates according to legal rather than arbitrary principles. The shopkeeper who notices unusual purchasing patterns, the concierge who observes the comings and goings of tenants, the postal worker who notes irregularities in correspondence. At the bottom level are the casual observer citizens who provide information occasionally and often unknowingly, simply by answering questions posed by more systematic agents. Financial pressure makes some individuals willing to supplement their income through intelligence work. Personal grievances create others who see surveillance as a means of settling scores with neighbors, colleagues, or rivals. Political ambition motivates still others who believe that cooperation with the authorities might advance their careers or social standing. The most effective informants are often those who genuinely believe they are serving the empire's interests, protecting it from threats that they have been taught to recognize and fear. Above them are the regular informants, individuals who have been recruited to provide ongoing reports about specific communities, organizations, or individuals. At the highest level are the professional agents, men and women, who have made careers of surveillance work and who possess the skills necessary to penetrate the most sensitive circles of potential opposition. The tavern keeper, who overhears conversations that touch on political matters. All of these individuals contribute to a flow of information that eventually finds its way into the carefully organized archives of the imperial police. They are not the dramatic figures of popular imagination. No dark cloaks or mysterious disguises mark their profession. Instead, they wear the modest clothing of civil servants, their appearance so unremarkable that they could pass unnoticed through any crowd, which is precisely the point. The most effective surveillance operates through invisibility, through the systematic cultivation of ordinariness that allows observers to blend seamlessly into the social fabric. They are charged with monitoring. The year is 1810, the height of Napoleon's continental dominance, and you are witnessing the daily operations of perhaps the most sophisticated surveillance apparatus that Europe has ever known. The building itself, with its maze of offices and interconnected chambers, reflects the complexity of the system. It houses a bureaucratic machine designed to monitor, catalog, and control the thoughts and actions of every citizen within the empire's vast reach. The men who populate these offices arrive each morning with the punctuality of clerks. The filing system that organizes this information represents one of the administrative marvels of the age, a testament to the empire's commitment to bureaucratic precision in all its endeavors. The language used in these reports follows conventions that have been developed through years of practice, creating a specialized vocabulary that allows sensitive information to be recorded and transmitted without unnecessary risk. The network of informants that feeds this system operates according to carefully constructed hierarchies and protocols that ensure both effectiveness and security. The recruitment of informants follows patterns that exploit the natural tensions and vulnerabilities that exist in any complex society. The training provided to these agents reflects the empire's understanding that effective surveillance requires not just observation skills, but also psychological insight and social sophistication. They learn to recognize the subtle signs that might indicate political disaffection, the slight hesitation when official policies are mentioned, the careful neutrality that masks actual opinions, the pattern of associations that suggests hidden loyalties. They develop techniques for encouraging confidential conversation without appearing to seek information, for maintaining cover stories that explain their presence in various social settings, for remembering and accurately reporting complex conversations without taking notes that might compromise their missions. The physical infrastructure that supports this surveillance network extends far beyond the central offices of the Prefecture of Police to encompass a vast array of facilities and resources throughout the empire. These analysts work to identify patterns that might indicate emerging threats, to trace connections between individuals who might be planning opposition activities, to assess the reliability of different sources and the credibility of specific reports. Not every piece of negative information about a citizen results in immediate action. The authorities understand that excessive use of police power could create more problems than it solves. Instead, the information is carefully evaluated to determine its reliability, its significance, and the most appropriate response, providing the government with detailed information about public opinion, economic conditions, and social trends that helps inform policy decisions. The reports that flow into police headquarters include observations about food prices and availability, about employment conditions in various industries, about the effectiveness of government propaganda efforts, about the popularity of specific officials and policies. This intelligence helps the empire maintain its effectiveness and legitimacy by providing early warning of problems that might require government attention and by allowing officials to adjust their approaches based on accurate information about public response. Some intelligence results in increased surveillance of particular individuals. Other information leads to administrative measures that limit opportunities for suspicious activity. And only the most serious cases result in arrest and prosecution. Their work involves not just the processing of raw intelligence, but also the construction of narratives that explain the significance of observed phenomena and predict their likely development. Safe houses provide meeting places where agents can deliver reports and receive instructions without risk of observation. Dead drops allow for the secure transmission of written intelligence when direct contact is too dangerous. And pervasive, affecting not just those who are actively monitored, but everyone who lives with the knowledge that monitoring is possible. The awareness that casual conversations might be overheard and reported, that personal correspondence might be intercepted and read, that business and social associations might be scrutinized for political implications. This knowledge creates a climate of self-consciousness and restraint that shapes every aspect of social interaction. People learn to speak carefully, to write cautiously, to choose their associates with awareness of the potential political consequences of their relationships. Communication networks ensure that information collected in distant provinces reaches Paris with minimal delay, while also allowing central authorities to coordinate surveillance operations across vast geographical areas. The integration of postal surveillance into this broader system represents perhaps the most invasive aspect of the imperial police apparatus. Every letter that passes through the official mail system is subject to potential interception, opening, copying, and analysis. The techniques developed for this work require considerable skill methods for opening sealed correspondence without leaving traces, for copying documents quickly and accurately, for analyzing handwriting and coding systems, for detecting invisible inks and other means of concealed communication. The psychological impact of this surveillance extends far beyond the actual letters that are intercepted, as knowledge of the system's existence affects how people think about their correspondence and their ability to communicate privately with friends and family. The analysis and interpretation of the information collected through these various means requires specialists who possess both analytical skills and deep knowledge of the political and social dynamics that govern imperial society. The decision-making processes that determine how surveillance information is used reflect the empire's attempt to balance security needs with legal and political considerations. The psychological impact of this surveillance system on the general population is profound. The empire's surveillance apparatus also serves functions beyond simple security monitoring. As the afternoon shadows lengthen across the stone floors of the prefecture, and the clerks continue their methodical work of cataloging human behavior, the true sophistication of Napoleon's surveillance state begins to reveal itself not merely in its mechanisms of observation, but in the elaborate systems of coded communication that have evolved to serve both those who watch and those who seek to evade watching. The recommendation of certain authors serves as a way of identifying political sympathies. Praise for Tacitus might indicate Republican sentiments, while enthusiasm for Plutarch could suggest democratic inclinations. A play set in ancient Rome might actually be commenting on contemporary French politics, with characters and situations that parallel current officials and circumstances. The selection of biblical texts for sermons can convey messages about political resistance and moral obligation that challenge imperial claims to absolute authority. The timing of religious observances can serve as a form of political protest. The emphasis given to certain saints' days, or the manner in which traditional festivals are celebrated, can express opinions about the proper relationship between secular and religious authority. The language used in prayers and religious instruction can preserve ideas about human dignity and moral responsibility that provide alternative frameworks for understanding political obligation. The choice of musical selections for concerts can convey political messages to audiences who understand the associations attached to particular composers or pieces. The arrangement of objects in paintings or the selection of subjects for artistic treatment can communicate political opinions to viewers who possess the cultural knowledge necessary to interpret these visual codes. The discussion of historical events provides cover for commentary on contemporary politics. Debates about the fall of the Roman Republic allow for veiled criticism of imperial ambitions, while analysis of the French Revolution as early phases permits exploration of ideas about popular sovereignty and constitutional government that would be dangerous to express directly. The empire has created, quite unintentionally, a parallel language of gesture, reference, and implication that allows its citizens to navigate the dangerous waters of political expression while maintaining the appearance of complete loyalty to the imperial system. The development of these communication codes represents one of the most fascinating aspects of life under the Napoleonic police state. Citizens who wish to express opinions that might be considered dangerous or disloyal have learned to embed their true meanings within conversations that appear, on the surface, to be entirely innocuous. A discussion of the weather becomes a way of commenting on political conditions. The storm clouds seem to be gathering in the east might refer to military developments along the Russian frontier, while I hope the harvest will be better this year, could express optimism about the possibility of peace. These metaphorical systems develop organically within communities, spread through networks of trusted associates, and evolve constantly to stay ahead of the surveillance apparatus that seeks to decode them. The bookshops and reading societies that serve Paris' educated population have become particularly sophisticated laboratories for the development of coded political discourse. The theatrical and artistic communities have developed their own elaborate systems for political communication that operate through layers of symbolism and illusion that require considerable cultural sophistication to decode. The religious communities that maintain some independence from direct state control have created their own methods for expressing dissent and preserving alternative sources of authority. The commercial networks that connect merchants and traders throughout the empire have developed sophisticated systems for transmitting information that serves both business and political purposes. The prices quoted for particular goods can carry encoded information about political developments in distant regions. Teachers who must present approved curricula nevertheless find ways to expose their students to broader intellectual traditions through careful selection of examples, through emphasis on certain aspects of officially sanctioned material, and through the cultivation of critical thinking, skills that may eventually lead students to question official orthodoxies. The letters that pass between relatives in different regions carry news and commentary that reflects local perspectives rather than official interpretations of events. The gatherings that bring extended families together for traditional celebrations provide opportunities for political discussion that is protected by the privacy of domestic space and the trust that exists between blood relatives. The marriage connections that link different social groups create networks of loyalty and information sharing that operate independently of official structures. Students develop their own networks for sharing forbidden books, for discussing dangerous ideas, and for maintaining intellectual independence despite the conformist pressures of their institutional environment. The informal gatherings where veterans share memories of their service provide opportunities for political discussion that draws on shared experiences and common loyalties. The assistance networks that help veterans and their families deal with the practical problems of civilian life create bonds of mutual obligation that sometimes take precedence over official loyalties. The preservation of military traditions and customs within veteran communities maintains alternative sources of authority and identity that can challenge civilian governmental claims to exclusive loyalty. The timing of commercial transactions can convey messages about the stability of particular governments or the likelihood of military action. Lawyers who must work within the imperial legal system nevertheless maintain professional relationships that allow them to discuss the philosophical foundations of law and justice. Physicians who serve the empire as medical needs maintain scientific connections that expose them to international developments and alternative approaches to their professional responsibilities. Engineers and technicians who work on imperial projects share information about foreign innovations and different approaches to technical problems that sometimes carry political implications. The choice of business partners and the terms of commercial agreements can express political preferences and loyalties that would be dangerous to communicate through more direct channels. The educational institutions that prepare young people for careers in imperial service have become sites where competing loyalties and alternative ideas struggle for influence despite official oversight. The professional associations that bring together individuals with similar occupations or interests have created informal networks that serve as alternatives to official channels for the exchange of information and opinion. The family networks that connect individuals across geographical and social boundaries have become crucial channels for the transmission of information and opinion that bypasses official surveillance. The veterans communities that preserve the memory and traditions of military service under the empire have developed particularly complex systems for maintaining group identity and mutual support despite official policies that seek to integrate former soldiers into civilian society. The underground networks that provide services illegal under imperial law have developed sophisticated systems for security and communication that rival those of the official police apparatus. The smuggling operations that circumvent the continental blockade require elaborate coordination and communication systems that must remain invisible to government surveillance. The private libraries that preserve banned books and manuscripts require careful security measures to protect both the materials and their users from official discovery. The discussion groups that explore alternative political theories must develop methods for identifying trustworthy participants and excluding potential informants. The correspondence networks that connect like-minded individuals across the empire need sophisticated methods for concealing the true purpose and content of their communications. The networks that help political refugees escape from imperial territory need secure methods for transmitting information and coordinating activities across international boundaries. The black market operations that provide goods and services unavailable through official channels develop their own systems of trust and verification that operate independently of legal structures. The intellectual circles that maintain interest in philosophical and political ideas beyond those officially approved have created elaborate systems for sharing forbidden literature and engaging in dangerous discussions while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to imperial ideology. The economic consequences of surveillance create additional layers of human cost that ripple through society in ways that are often invisible to the authorities who design and implement these systems. A merchant who is suspected of political unreliability may find that government contracts are awarded to competitors. That licenses. The knowledge that political indiscretion can result in serious consequences creates pressure on parents to monitor and control their children as speech and associations. Children learn to be careful about what they say at school, knowing that teachers might report politically questionable comments to authorities. The cells are not designed to torture the body, but to break the spirit. Small, dark spaces that isolate prisoners from human contact and deprive them of the social interaction that gives meaning to human existence. Officials who possess detailed information about citizens' private lives are in position to demand favors, extract payments, and settle personal scores under the cover of political investigation. The secret nature of surveillance operations makes oversight difficult and accountability nearly impossible. The financial incentives that encourage informants to provide information create pressure to exaggerate incidents, invent accusations, and interpret innocent behavior as evidence of political crimes. The daily routines are designed to emphasize the prisoner as powerlessness and dependence on the state for every basic need. The uncertainty about the length of imprisonment and the possibility of release creates psychological pressure that often proves more effective than physical coercion in breaking down resistance. Spouses become cautious about discussing political matters even in the privacy of their homes, aware that domestic servants or neighbors might overhear and report their conversations. Children whose fathers have been arrested for political crimes carry the stigma of their family's disgrace throughout their lives. Wives of political prisoners find themselves unable to obtain employment, refused service by merchants, and excluded from social activities. The extended family networks that normally provide support during times of crisis often dissolve under the pressure of political association, leaving political prisoners' families isolated and vulnerable. The trust and openness that should characterize family relationships becomes another casualty of the empire's security concerns. And permits are delayed or denied, that business associates become reluctant to maintain commercial relationships. The men and women who are arrested for political crimes disappear into a legal system that operates according to its own logic rather than traditional concepts of justice and due process. The evidence against them often consists of surveillance reports that they are not allowed to examine testimony from informants whose identities are not revealed, and interpretations of their words and actions that may bear little resemblance to their actual intentions. The trials, when they occur, follow forms that create the appearance of legal procedure while actually serving the empire's political needs. These economic pressures rarely result in dramatic confrontations or obvious injustices, but they create a steady erosion of opportunity and prosperity that affects not just the targeted individual, but their employees, suppliers, and dependents. The impact on family life represents perhaps the most profound human cost of the empire's surveillance apparatus. The treatment of political prisoners reveals the human face of the imperial justice system and the way that bureaucratic efficiency can mask profound cruelty. The conditions in which political prisoners are held reflect the empire's approach to the management of dissent through systematic demoralization rather than dramatic punishment. The impact on the families of political prisoners creates ripple effects that extend throughout their communities. The corruption that inevitably develops within surveillance systems creates additional opportunities for abuse and injustice. The international dimensions of imperial surveillance create problems that extend beyond France's borders to affect the empire's relationships with other countries. The networks of agents and informants that operate in foreign capitals create diplomatic incidents when they are discovered. People who have learned to monitor their own speech and behavior continue to do so, even when the threats that made such caution necessary have disappeared. Communities that have been fractured by suspicion and mistrust require generations to rebuild the social bonds that were destroyed by surveillance. The habits of mind that are necessary for survival under police-state conditions. Suspicion, caution, emotional distance become permanent features of personality that affect every aspect of human relationship. The interception of correspondence between French citizens and foreign contacts creates suspicions about treason and espionage that may have no basis in reality. The clerks who tend this system go home to their own families, perhaps unaware of the irony that their work in the service of imperial security is gradually eroding the very social bonds and human relationships that give meaning to the society they are supposed to protect. In the morning, they will return to their desks, open new files, and continue the endless work of reducing human complexity to bureaucratic categories, never quite understanding that the precision of their methods cannot compensate for the imprecision of their understanding of the human heart. The surveillance of foreign visitors to France creates tensions with other governments and makes international cooperation more difficult. The long-term consequences of living under systematic surveillance include psychological and social changes that persist long after the immediate security concerns have been resolved. As the night deepens and the prefecture of police settles into its evening rhythms, the files continue to grow, the reports continue to accumulate, and the machinery of surveillance continues its methodical work of cataloging human behavior. Picture yourself stepping through the ornate gates of the Hôtel de Soubise on a crisp evening in 1808, your footsteps echoing against marble floors that reflect the light of 1,000 candles. And imagine the profound contrast between this world of imperial privilege and the careful, constrained existence of ordinary Parisians that we have been exploring together. Here in the grand salons and gilded chambers that house Napoleon's inner circle, a different kind of survival unfolds. One measured not in bread rations and conscription notices. The morning levees that were once the privilege of Bourbon courtiers have been adapted to serve Napoleon's new aristocracy. They are theaters where political loyalty is performed and evaluated marketplaces where favors and influence are traded. The empire's style that characterizes fashion during this period represents a conscious rejection of the elaborate ornamentation that marked aristocratic dress under the old regime, replacing it with cleaner lines and classical references that suggest both republican virtue and imperial dignity. The women who attend these gatherings wear gowns inspired by ancient Greek and Roman models, their hair arranged in styles that evoke classical antiquity, their jewelry featuring motifs drawn from imperial iconography. The men appear in uniforms that blend military functionality with ceremonial grandeur, their decorations and insignia creating a complex visual language that communicates rank, achievement, and imperial favor. Intelligence networks, where information about domestic and foreign affairs is gathered and disseminated, and cultural laboratories, where the aesthetic and intellectual foundations of the empire are negotiated and established. The hostesses who preside over these gatherings possess skills that rival those of professional diplomats. The ability to manage conversations that touch on sensitive topics without allowing them to become dangerous. The talent for encouraging useful connections while preventing harmful associations. The sophistication to present imperial policy in terms that appeal to cultured audiences while maintaining perfect loyalty to official positions, but with crucial differences that reflect the meritocratic principles upon which the empire is supposedly founded. Where birth once determined precedence, military achievement and administrative competence now establish hierarchies. Where hereditary titles once conferred automatic respect, imperial honors must be constantly reinforced through continued service and demonstrated loyalty. But in the delicate navigation of court, intrigue the careful display of loyalty and magnificence, and the constant awareness that proximity to power brings both extraordinary opportunity and extraordinary danger. The architecture itself tells the story of imperial ambition and the rapid social transformation that has characterized Napoleon's reign. These magnificent hotels particulier, many of them confiscated from emigrants who fled during the Revolution, have been redistributed to the new nobility that the emperor has created from his generals, administrators, and supporters. The irony is not lost on observers that Marshal Murat now occupies chambers that once belonged to a duke who lost his head to the guillotine, or that Josephine as ladies-in-waiting hold their receptions in salons where aristocratic hostesses once entertained the court of Louis. See, the daily rhythm of life among the imperial elite follows patterns that are simultaneously familiar and completely transformed from the old regime. The salons that gather each evening in these magnificent residences serve multiple functions that extend far beyond mere social entertainment. The dress codes that govern these social gatherings reflect the empire's attempt to create new symbols of status and authority that draw upon both classical precedents and contemporary innovations. The conversation economic foundations. The musical evenings that feature compositions celebrating imperial victories. The poetry readings that present works glorifying French civilization. The dramatic performances that retell classical stories with contemporary political resonance. All of these cultural events help to create and maintain the intellectual framework that justifies imperial authority and encourages continued loyalty among the educated classes. They learn languages and accomplishments that will make them useful as diplomats and administrators. They develop social skills that will allow them to function effectively in court society, and they absorb the political sophistication necessary to navigate the complex relationships that govern imperial politics. But they also witness the anxiety and insecurity that characterizes even the most successful members of the imperial elite, the constant awareness that favor can be withdrawn as quickly as it is granted, and the knowledge that their families' fortunes depend entirely upon the continued success and approval of a single man. That support this world of luxury and refinement rest upon the systematic exploitation of the empire's vast resources and the careful distribution of rewards that ensure continued loyalty among the elite. The fortunes that fund these magnificent establishments come from a variety of sources. military plunder acquired during successful campaigns, administrative positions that provide access to government resources, commercial privileges that allow for profitable speculation, and direct grants from the imperial treasury that reward exceptional service or demonstrate imperial favor. The careful management of these economic relationships requires constant attention to the political implications of financial decisions, as wealth in the imperial system is never merely personal, but always carries obligations and expectations that link individual prosperity to imperial success. That takes place in these elevated circles operates according to rules that are both more sophisticated and more dangerous than those that govern ordinary social interaction. The topics that can be discussed safely include military campaigns, administrative innovations, and cultural developments. The subjects that must be approached with extreme caution include foreign policy, domestic opposition, and personal relationships within the imperial family. The servant networks that maintain these grand households represent a microcosm of the broader imperial system, with hierarchies based on skill, loyalty, and access to sensitive information. The major domo who oversees a marshal's establishment possesses knowledge about his employer's finances, correspondence, and personal relationships that could be extremely valuable to the imperial police. The ladies, maids who dress the wives and daughters of the imperial elite, have access to private conversations that might reveal political opinions or family secrets. The cooks who prepare elaborate dinners for important guests can observe which officials dine together, how long private conferences last, and what moods characterize particular political relationships. The cultural activities that provide entertainment and intellectual stimulation for the imperial elite serve additional functions as tools of political control and ideological reinforcement. The children who grow up in this rarefied environment receive an education that prepares them for roles in the imperial system while also exposing them to the tensions and contradictions that characterize life at the pinnacle of power. The marriage strategies that govern family alliances within the imperial elite reflect the systematic approach that Napoleon applies to all aspects of social organization. Marriages are arranged not merely to unite compatible individuals or even to consolidate economic advantages, but to create political alliances that serve broader imperial interests. The diplomatic receptions that bring foreign representatives into contact with French officials require careful choreography to ensure that appropriate precedence is observed that's sensitive. Political topics are handled diplomatically, and that imperial magnificence is displayed in ways that impress foreign observers without revealing state secrets or strategic intentions. The presence of allied princes and their courts in Paris creates opportunities for cultural exchange and political cooperation, but also generates tensions and jealousies that must be carefully managed to prevent diplomatic incidents. The daughter of a successful general might be married to the son of an important administrator, creating family connections that link military and civilian leadership. The sister of a loyal prefect might be matched with a promising young officer, ensuring that administrative and military elites develop personal as well as professional relationships. The international dimensions of imperial court society create additional layers of complexity that affect every aspect of social interaction among the elite. As the evening progresses and the initial ceremonies of arrival and greeting give way to the more intimate conversations that characterize the later hours of imperial social gatherings, the true complexity of navigating life within Napoleon's inner circle begins to reveal itself through countless small interactions, subtle negotiations, and careful calculations that determine who rises and who falls within the imperial hierarchy. The emperor's temperament, always mercurial, has become increasingly unpredictable as the pressures of governing an empire that stretches from Madrid to Warsaw take their toll on his physical and emotional reserves. The marshals who have conquered kingdoms and administered provinces find themselves competing with administrative officials for a few minutes of private conversation that might advance their projects or protect their positions. The distribution of titles, decorations, and financial grants follows carefully calculated patterns designed to create competition among potential recipients, while ensuring that rewards are substantial enough to maintain motivation, but not so generous as to create independence from imperial authority. The Legion of Honor that recognizes exceptional service operates at multiple levels, creating hierarchies within hierarchies that allow for precise calibration of recognition and reward. The financial benefits that accompany imperial favor are structured to create ongoing dependence rather than permanent security, ensuring that even the most successful courtiers remain motivated to continue their efforts to please their sovereign. The diplomats who negotiate with foreign powers discover that their success in international affairs means little if they cannot successfully navigate the treacherous waters of domestic court politics. The Empress Josephine, despite her questionable political judgment and her increasingly strained relationship with Napoleon, continues to exercise significant influence over court society through her ability to control access to the emperor and her skill in managing the social relationships that determine which families rise or fall within the imperial hierarchy. The salons hosted by the wives of marshals and ministers become venues for political negotiation that operate according to different rules than formal governmental meetings, allowing for the exploration of ideas and the formation of alliances that might be impossible in official settings. The scholars and artists who contribute to the cultural glory of the empire learn that talent and achievement alone are insufficient if they lack the political sophistication necessary to maintain imperial favor. A general who approaches him on a day when military dispatches have brought news of setbacks in Spain might find himself reassigned to administrative duties, while the same general presenting identical proposals during a period of favorable news might receive promotion and increased responsibilities. The courtiers who survive and prosper in this environment develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to the subtle signs that indicate the emperor's state of mind, the way he holds his shoulders, the speed of his walking pace, the tone he uses when addressing subordinates, the topics he chooses to discuss or avoid during formal audiences. The drawing rooms that seemed so magnificently appointed in the bright light of early evening now take on a more shadowy quality. The conversations become more guarded, and the smiles that were once broad and welcoming acquire the careful precision of diplomatic communications. The art of reading Napoleon's moods has become a specialized skill among his courtiers, one that can literally determine the trajectory of careers and the fate of families. The competition for imperial attention creates dynamics that transform even the most talented and accomplished individuals into something resembling anxious courtiers, whose primary skill becomes the ability to present themselves and their achievements in ways that capture and hold Napoleon's notoriously short attention span. The system of imperial honors and rewards operates according to principles that reflect Napoleon's understanding of human psychology and his systematic approach to maintaining loyalty among his subordinates. The wives and daughters of the imperial elite navigate their own complex social landscape that parallels, but differs significantly from the political maneuvering that occupies their husbands and fathers. The younger generation of imperial nobles, those who have grown up within the system rather than adapting to it from previous careers in the military or administration, present particular challenges and opportunities for the management of imperial succession. These young men and women possess the cultural sophistication and social skills necessary to function effectively in international diplomatic and social settings, but they often lack the military experience and administrative competence that characterize their parents' generation. Their education and social development become matters of imperial policy. The painters who create portraits of imperial officials and their families must balance artistic integrity with the political necessity of presenting their subjects in ways that enhance rather than compromise their standing within the imperial hierarchy. The musicians who compose works for court entertainments must navigate between the desire to create innovative and emotionally powerful art and the requirement that their work support, rather than challenge, imperial ideology. The writers who produce literature for consumption by the educated elite must find ways to explore universal human themes while avoiding any suggestion that individual desires or moral principles might take precedence over imperial authority. As Napoleon recognizes that the long-term stability of his dynasty depends upon creating a new generation of leaders who combine aristocratic refinement with practical competence and unquestioning loyalty to imperial authority. The international marriage negotiations that link the imperial family to European royalty represent the culmination of Napoleon's systematic approach to converting military conquest into lasting political legitimacy. The complex arrangements that eventually result in his marriage to Marie Louise of Austria require years of careful diplomatic preparation and involve considerations that extend far beyond personal compatibility or romantic attraction. The costs of maintaining the magnificent establishments that house the imperial elite funding, the elaborate entertainments that demonstrate imperial grandeur, providing the gifts and grants that reward loyal service, and supporting the complex diplomatic activities that maintain relationships with foreign courts. All of these expenses must be balanced against the empire's military needs and the political necessity of maintaining at least minimal support among the general population. The social integration of foreign princesses into French court society creates challenges that affect every level of imperial social organization, as established hierarchies must be adjusted to accommodate new personalities whose presence carries significant political implications for the empire's relationship with other European powers. The economic management of imperial court society requires resources on a scale that strains even the substantial wealth that the empire has acquired through conquest and systematic exploitation of its territories. The cultural production that emerges from imperial court society reflects the complex relationship between artistic creativity and political control that characterizes all aspects of life under Napoleon's rule. As midnight approaches and the grand entertainments of the imperial elite begin their graceful transformation from public spectacle to private intimacy, the true cost of living within Napoleon's inner circle becomes visible in the exhausted faces of courtiers who have spent the evening performing loyalty. The careful conversations of spouses who must discuss family matters while remaining conscious that their servants might be reporting to the imperial police, and the sleepless anxiety of officials who know that tomorrow might bring news that could fundamentally alter their position within the imperial hierarchy. The constant vigilance required to avoid political missteps creates a state of chronic tension that affects both mental and physical health. The irregular schedules that result from the emperor's unpredictable demands and changing priorities disrupt normal patterns of rest and recreation. As the demands of court service often conflict with the natural obligations and affections that bind parents to children, husbands to wives, and individuals to their broader family networks, they learn early to present themselves in ways that please their parents' political superiors, to speak carefully about topics that might have political implications, and to understand that their personal desires and individual preferences must always be subordinated to the broader requirements of family loyalty and imperial service. The education they receive, while sophisticated and comprehensive, is always shaped by political considerations that may limit their exposure to ideas or perspectives that could be considered dangerous to imperial authority. The extended absences required by military campaigns and administrative duties prevent normal family development and create emotional distances that persist even when family members are physically reunited. The political considerations that govern marriage and career decisions within the imperial elite often override personal preferences and individual happiness, creating unions that serve imperial interests while potentially sacrificing the emotional fulfillment of the individuals involved. The rich food and constant social drinking that characterize imperial entertainments take their toll on constitutions that were perhaps better adapted to the simpler dietary patterns of military campaigns or provincial administration. The elaborate clothing and ceremonial requirements of court dress create physical discomfort that must be endured without complaint, as any sign of weakness or dissatisfaction might be interpreted as evidence of insufficient dedication to imperial service. The physical toll of court life manifests itself in ways that would be invisible to casual observers, but become apparent to anyone who spends extended time among the imperial elite. The marshals who have witnessed the carnage of major battles must publicly celebrate victories, while privately calculating the human cost of imperial ambition. The administrators who have seen the economic strain that constant warfare places on provincial populations must express enthusiasm for new campaigns, while knowing that success will require sacrifices that may exceed the empire's capacity to sustain them. The diplomats who understand the international isolation that results from Napoleon's aggressive policies must defend French positions while recognizing that the empire's foreign relations are deteriorating in ways that could ultimately prove catastrophic. The psychological pressure of maintaining perfect loyalty while harboring private doubts about imperial policies creates internal conflicts that become particularly acute during periods of military setback or political crisis. The impact on family relationships creates perhaps the most poignant aspect of life within the imperial elite. The children who grow up within this environment develop psychological adaptations that reflect both the privileges and the burdens of their elevated social position. The competition among families within the imperial elite creates social dynamics that can become particularly destructive when political circumstances change rapidly. The alliances and rivalries that develop during periods of imperial success may become dangerous liabilities when military fortunes decline, or when shifts in imperial policy alter the relative importance of different governmental functions. The families who have invested heavily in relationships with particular officials may find themselves vulnerable if those officials fall from favor, while families who have maintained broader networks of connection may be better positioned to survive political upheavals. The financial management required to maintain appropriate social standing within the imperial elite creates economic pressures that can become overwhelming, even for families with substantial resources. The necessity of supporting imperial policy in all public statements limits the range of topics that can be explored in conversation and correspondence. The requirement that all artistic and literary production serve imperial interests restricts the kind of cultural activities that can be safely pursued. The knowledge that intellectual curiosity itself might be viewed with suspicion if it extends to politically sensitive areas creates a climate of self-censorship that affects even private thought and study. The costs of maintaining magnificent residences, funding elaborate entertainments, providing appropriate gifts and donations, and supporting the extended networks of servants and dependents that enable participation in court society require constant attention to income and expenditure. The servants who help them remove their elaborate court dress observe the physical exhaustion that results from maintaining perfect posture and appropriate expressions throughout hours of public performance. They dream of imperial audiences that go badly, of political mistakes that result in disgrace and exile, of military defeats that destroy the foundations of their prosperity, of family members who suffer because of their political associations. But they also dream of continued success, of greater honors and responsibilities, of their children achieving even higher positions within the imperial hierarchy, of the glory and satisfaction that comes from service to a cause greater than themselves. The private secretaries who handle their correspondence must carefully manage communications that might be intercepted and analyzed by the imperial police. The family members who share their most intimate thoughts must remember that even domestic conversations might have political implications if overheard or reported. The irregular nature of imperial rewards and the possibility that favor might be withdrawn without warning make long-term financial planning extremely difficult and create anxiety about economic security that affects even the wealthiest members of the imperial hierarchy. The international implications of membership in Napoleon's inner circle create additional complications that affect every aspect of personal and professional life. The families who have achieved prominence within the imperial system find themselves associated with French policies that may be deeply unpopular in other European countries, limiting their ability to travel safely, maintain foreign business relationships, or seek refuge abroad if political circumstances in France become threatening. The knowledge that their prominence makes them potential targets for enemy intelligence services create security concerns that affect their daily routines and social interactions. The cultural and intellectual constraints that govern acceptable thought and expression within imperial court society create frustrations that may be particularly acute for individuals with broad education and sophisticated tastes. As the evening finally draws to a close and the imperial elite retreat to their private chambers, they carry with them the accumulated weight of a day spent navigating the complex requirements of life at the pinnacle of power. The sleep that finally comes to these privileged individuals is often troubled by dreams that reflect the anxiety and uncertainty that characterize their waking hours. The dawn that will break on their magnificent residences will bring new challenges and opportunities, new tests of loyalty and competence, new occasions for the careful performance of imperial devotion that sustains both their positions and the broader system of which they are such crucial parts. As they prepare for another day of navigating the treacherous waters of imperial court society, they carry with them both the privileges and the burdens of their elevated position, the knowledge that they have achieved a level of influence and prosperity that would have been unimaginable to previous generations, but also the understanding that everything they have gained depends upon their continued ability to satisfy the demands of a system that recognizes no loyalty higher than service to the empire, and no security greater than the temporary favor of its absolute ruler. And so, as our journey through the streets and salons, the bureaus and battlefields of Napoleon's Paris draws to its gentle close, allow yourself to sink even deeper into the comfort of your bed, feeling the weight of these historical burdens lift from your shoulders like morning mist rising from the Seine. The ordinary citizen awakening in 1810 carried burdens that we can scarcely imagine. The knowledge that their son might be conscripted at any moment, the knowledge that every letter might be opened, every conversation potentially overheard, every association carefully noted and connection that allowed them to maintain their humanity despite the dehumanizing pressures of imperial life. The retreat from Moscow, the coalition of enemies that would finally bring Napoleon down, the foreign occupation and political restoration that would follow all of these events, would create new forms of hardship and uncertainty for the people whose daily struggles we have witnessed. But the resilience and adaptability that allowed them to survive under imperial rule would serve them well in navigating these new challenges, demonstrating the remarkable capacity of human beings to endure and even flourish under conditions that might seem impossible to those who have never faced such tests. The coded conversations that allowed political opinions to be shared safely, the family networks that preserved alternative sources of loyalty and identity, the professional communities that maintained standards of excellence and integrity despite political pressure. These represent triumphs of the human spirit that shine all the brighter for the darkness of the circumstances that surrounded them. And analyze this created a psychological landscape where the boundary between public and private life had been almost completely erased. The very concept of authentic self-expression became a luxury that few could afford, as survival required the constant performance of loyalty and the careful suppression of doubt. That their words might be reported to authorities, that their livelihood depended upon navigating an ever-changing maze of imperial regulations and expectations. Even the most privileged members of society, those marshals and ministers, whose names filled the newspapers and whose carriages rolled through the finest quarters of the city, lived with the constant awareness that their fortunes rested entirely upon the continued favor of a single Man whose moods were as unpredictable as the outcomes of his military campaigns. The world we have explored together, that intricate tapestry of survival, surveillance, ambition, and anxiety that characterized life under the empire, belongs now to the realm of memory and imagination, its immediacy dissolved by the passage of time into something that can be contemplated with the detached fascination that comes from absolute safety. Think for a moment about the extraordinary complexity of simply existing within Napoleon's system, the mental energy required each morning to calculate the political implications of every conversation, every purchase, every association. The surveillance apparatus we witnessed, with its meticulous files and networks of informants, its coded communications and bureaucratic euphemisms, represents something almost alien to our contemporary understanding of privacy and individual autonomy. Yet perhaps most remarkable of all was the way that ordinary people adapted to these extraordinary circumstances, developing their own systems of meaning. The empire's eventual collapse, which we know was approaching, even during the period we have explored, would bring its own forms of suffering and disruption.